So Jeremiah Baruch asked me, um, did Muhammad exist, or did I think Muhammad existed? And I answered him along the lines of, um, probably was a man named Abu Al-Qasim who was a warlord among the early Saracens. But as for Muhammad described in um, the Sunnah, the Sirah, and the Tafsir, no, probably not. Well, almost certainly not. The historicity between Christ and Muhammad. Okay. Now, everything that was written in the New Testament, we have it from, we have independent sources, right? We have Mark, we have John, we have Matthew and Luke, which are using Mark but also using Q. We also have Paul, so it's four right there. James, Jude, First Peter, Second Peter, the Apocalypse of John, and then also Luke Acts. That's another one. And then we have, and that everything, all this was written within decades. Um, Mark probably within 10 to 25 years after the events, maybe 30. It's like asking somebody, hey, do you remember your tour in Vietnam? Well, that was longer from now, and there's people who clearly remember what happened, what they did in Vietnam, than remembering the execution of your religious leader uh, and writing it down. More time has passed. So we also have Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, that are talking about this Christian cult that was started by this guy, Jesus, who was executed under Pontius Pilate. Not to mention, Josephus mentions Jesus three different places. He mentions Jesus' brother, James. He mentions John the Baptist. And nothing conflicts. That's all, yeah, that started up. This apocalyptic preacher came out. Some believed he was the Messiah or the Son of God, and then he was crucified, and they believe he resurrected. And you also get people who knew the apostles. Well, actually, you have a guy who, during the lifetime, Marbar Serapion, during the life of Jesus, wrote about him, right? And then you have people like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Papias, uh, and then you have just a whole lineage of writings from this, right? And you even have stuff coming down officially from Rome, like Nero blaming the Christians and persecuting them. And the earliest fragment of any gospel is the Ryland's Papyrus from called P52 from AD 115. So it means it's a second copy. And with the amount of manuscript data from ancient times, just in Greek alone, 5,000 manuscripts, something like 10,000 in Latin, 3,000 in Syriac, and the variants are negligible. Muhammad is said to be one of the most attested to people in history. Well, let's look at that. Sahih al-Bukhari, the most reliable piece of writing or collection of stories after the Quran in Islam. And by the way, the Quran mentions Muhammad, I think, 4 times. And all of the flora and fauna only match Palestine. It doesn't match Mecca or Medina, and Mecca did not exist during the time it was supposed to live. Not to mention, there isn't a shred of evidence that the Rashidun Caliphate existed. But let's go through some historical stuff, right? Now, a reliable source, Sahih al-Bukhari, right? It was passed down through isnad chains, which is like telephone. So and so heard from so and so, who told so and so, who told so and so, and told so and so, and this went on for over 250 years until Bukhari got them. Almost 300 years until Bukhari got them. You know how many ahadith he had? 600,000. He winnowed it down to around 7,000, except most of those are just duplicate stories. So it's actually only about 2,200 from 600,000. A guy who was living, I believe, in Basra or Baghdad almost 300 years after the fact takes six, and they all had reliable isnad chains. 600,000 hadith, sayings about what Muhammad did, where he went, and he decided, just him, he winnowed it down to 2,000. When was the first biography of Muhammad written? Around 200 years after his supposed life, or 250, but we don't even have that. That was by Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasulullah. We have a redaction and a recension done by Ibn Hisham, and Al-Tabari also had a hand in it. So that's 300 years before we get the first biography. For the first 100 years of the Islamic Empire, keep in mind, this thing stretched from southern Spain to India. Not once did they mention Muhammad, the Quran, or having a new religion. The people they conquered didn't know that they had a new religion. There were whispers about this guy, but the Ishmaelites coming up, the Hagarenes, the Saracens. But you know what's funny is that Muhammad was a title that Christians used for Jesus, that Jews used for Moses, and that the Rahmanites, who called God Allah, and Al-Rahman, the most merciful, the most beneficent, I should say, that was their name for God. And let's say Muhammad established Islam, which what we know today as Islam. Even though the Quran, again, mentions Jesus hundreds of times, Abraham hundreds of times, Moses hundreds of times, Muhammad 4, mentions Mecca once, but it's actually Becca, which is a valley in Lebanon. Again, things like it mentions that they're a day's walk away. The city where this preacher is preaching these things in the Quran is a day's walk away from the Dead Sea. So obviously it's not 1,000 miles to the south in Mecca or Medina. It's in Palestine. Not to mention all of the flora and fauna that's recorded in the Quran being around this town where this preacher is at, could only be in Palestine, because they talk about mountains, olive groves, grapevines, everything. Vineyards, farmers, cattlemen, trade routes. None of that ever existed in what modern day Mecca is. All right. Oh, why didn't they know Islam doesn't allow images of animals or humans to be made because somebody might worship them? Well, then why was iconography rampant across the Umayyad Empire until Abdul Malik in the year 700 or 699? So for about 100 years, and even during the supposed period of the rightly guided caliphs, the earliest Muslims didn't know any of this Islamic Sharia law. I mean, the Greeks the Jews, the Romans, the Egyptians, the North Africans, these were all extremely literate places. The Persians, and nobody mentions this guy Muhammad or a Quran or that these people are Muslims. It's only after that they need to consolidate their empire under one religion, like how the Persians had Zoroastrianism. That's how they united a multi-ethnic empire, and the Byzantines had Christianity, and that's how they united that. And then the Khazars up north, who came around the same time as the Saracens rose up, chose Judaism. So these Ishmaelites, these Hagarenes, these Saracens said, "Oh yeah, well no, we have a prophet too. He came from Ishmael. Yeah, that's right." Um, so yeah, not to mention that there's stuff in the Quran that is far older than when it was supposed to be revealed. It talks about groups, heretical groups that died out 100 years before 622, when the era of Islam was supposedly began. They died out before this guy Muhammad actually was supposedly born, and his name wasn't Muhammad either. Muhammad is again a title that was applied to Moses and Jesus and even God, the praised one. Um, his name was Abu Al-Qasim, and all signs point to him being a Samaritan or an Edomite. Oh yeah, and the Quraysh, it actually isn't a tribe; it just means the confederation. Kind of like what happened when the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids fell, and they were the only ones that had armies because the Persians and the Romans just had a 30-year-long war and exhausted each other, so everything was defenseless, and they took over. So, the first person to write down the list of the caliphs was in 720, and it was Saint John of Damascus. And why didn't the Muslims know that there was a place called Mecca for the first 200 years of its existence? It was the center of the Islamic world was Damascus. Why did their coins have crosses on them and images of men? Why were they minting stuff like that? Why was the first thing they did was they built a shrine to the severed head of John the Baptist, and the second thing they did was they restored the temple. That's why they thought the Christians originally thought these were Jews, because what they started restoring the temple. And what does the Dome of the Rock say? The ancient inscription. It only talks about Jesus, and it mentions Muhammad once, but it seems to be applying that title to Jesus. Look at the inscription inside of the Dome of the Rock. It's only about Jesus. Um, Jesus is not the Son of God. He's only the prophet of God. And then it reiterates that about Muhammad. Well, nobody ever claimed that Muhammad was the Son of God. So it's pretty damn weak evidence. Abu al-Qasim probably was a Saracen raider, but 300 years of oral tradition, and then having 600,000 winnowed down to 2,000 by one guy in a different country. And that's where we get the first reliable source of hadith. And remember, the first biography of Muhammad was Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq, which is lost. It doesn't exist anymore. Only its later recension by Ibn Hisham exists. This is not a steady basis. Not to mention the empire that the Muslims founded for 100 years, well, over 100 years. They don't even mention Muhammad or a prophet or the Quran or a new religion at all. Christianity as a oppressed sect. The Romans knew about it. The Jews knew about it. The Christians were writing about what they believed. but you have an entire empire and that's supposedly based on Islam, and nobody speaks about Islam for first century. It doesn't make sense. So it's pretty. But if you say this, remember you'll be murdered by fanatics. So that's why nobody really wants to talk about this. Oh, and the archaeology is pretty damning too. I'll save that for later.